I want to begin by expressing my thanks to the organizers, and I mean the staff, the faculty, everyone who has been involved. I know this is a tremendous effort to put something like this on, and I'm grateful to be in the room. I should also correct my own bio. I'm not sure anymore that I'm writing a book called Reparations Unbound, but I'm delighted to have a chance to talk about reparations as a political concept, whether or not it realizes, the teleology of all academic projects that they must end between two covers. From the beginning, demands for reparations for slavery had been bound up with democracy's undoing. In 1783, when Belinda Sutton appealed to the Massachusetts legislature for a pension from the estate of Isaac Royal, a loyalist and her former enslaver, she made her case through a series of juxtapositions. First, the petition contrasted the vibrant West African world from which Sutton had been captured more than 50 years earlier with what she called the unpropitious country where death alone was to emancipate her. Second, it contrasted, quote, that freedom which the Almighty Father hath intended for all the human race with the state of affairs in England, where royal fled and where, in the petition's words, domination sits enthroned, pouring bloody outrage and cruelty on all who dare to be free. And third, the petition notes that how the laws of the land in the newly independent United States barred her, and again I quote, from the enjoyment of one morsel of that immense wealth, a part whereof hath been accumulated by her own industry, and the whole augmented by her servitude. Sutton's petition is widely cited as the first successful slavery reparations case in the United States, and indeed she was awarded a modest pension, although she had to return to the legislature more than once to demand payment. And it's unclear how much she ultimately received. What she did not receive, however, is at least as important. The historical record makes no acknowledgement of the cruel juxtapositions upon which her case relied, of the irreparability of her separation from family and friends, of the horror of scenes which her imagination had never conceived of in the slave ship's floating world, or of the imposition of an alien language, name, and religion in place of Sutton's own. Nor did her complaint usher in the kind of radical political transformation that would have been required to transfigure an unslaved or unowned existence into a free life. Instead, the Massachusetts legislature's reparative gesture inaugurated a history in which stories of captivity and bondage, even when they have yielded improvements in the condition of the enslaved and their descendants, have left the pretensions of white democracy intact. Doing justice in Belinda Sutton's case would have required democracy's undoing. Now, this undoing may not seem to be the same as the evisceration of democratic norms and institutions that so many of us have warned about with increasing urgency in recent years. Its explicit focus is not on the ways that rule by the people is being replaced by that of autocrats, while practices and norms of self-governance have been colonized by capital. It does not name the very real prospect that democracy, as the organizers observe, might be living through its truly final end. Yet my return to Sutton's petition neither minimizes nor detours from these concerns. Instead, I want to suggest that threats to democracy today are, among other things, connected to a long-standing failure to ask what it means to conceive rule by the people in the shadow of racial slavery, settlement, and colonialism. Sutton's petition offers a reminder that the US and other Western democracies are not only in danger, they have always posed a danger to non-white people within, beyond, and through their borders. Global struggles for reparations are not new. In the past dozen years or so, however, the idea that the future of democratic life requires confronting centuries of unredressed harm has enjoyed unprecedented prominence. International initiatives like CARICOM's 10-point plan for reparatory justice, the publication of Ta-Nehisi Coates' case for reparations, and uprisings on behalf of the idea that roads must fall and that Black Lives Matter made reparations newly thinkable. In the US, H.R. 40, a congressional proposal to establish a slavery reparations commission, passed out of committee in 2021, more than 30 years after it was first introduced. And mainstream civil rights organizations and political leaders, including several Democratic candidates for president in 2020, it seems like a very long time ago, declared their support for reparations, however vaguely defined. In the words of three leading historians of reparations, the struggle for reparatory justice has become, quote, a powerful global storm shaking the foundation of Western governments locally, nationally, and internationally. Today, of course, the prospect of a reparations storm seems dim, at least in the US, where genocidal policies are presented as common sense and words as anodyne as inclusion and diversity are being stripped from government websites. But I argue that the radical potential of reparations as a political concept remains vital to understanding democracy and its undoing. In other words, reparations demands are not a diversion from the crisis, but one key to confronting it. For they situate contemporary democracy in relation to ongoing racialized processes of political voicelessness, exploitation, and violent dispossession that, in the case of the US, date to and indeed before the founding. Further, by drawing on the visions of Black activists and artists whose imaginations, like Sutton's, exceed the terms of the existing political world, the language of reparations can serve as a vehicle for transforming the terms of democratic coexistence. But which demands, which language? For many leading advocates in the US, the answer is clear. Although they differ in the particulars, they center the ideal of making good on democratic promises rooted in the Declaration and the Constitution, or in Coates's word, realizing a wisdom worthy of the founders. This approach focuses on the harms endured by African American citizens, rightly connecting contemporary disparities in education, housing, health, policing, punishment, political voice, and nearly every dimension of life to slavery and its afterlives. Yet this conception of reparations comes at the cost of eliding the transnational scope of both slavery and repair on the one hand, and reinforcing the idea that democracy requires the shoring up of borders of many kinds on the other. Where appeals to national redemption do their work by binding the future to unjust features of the present, Sutton's petition asserts a different kind of demand. When she joins reparations to a narration of her own and others' irreparable losses, she situates US democracy within a history of forced migration and bondage, a history whose legacies have been renewed and innovated into the present. After considering the grip of national redemption stories in reparations discourse and tracing some of their costs, I return to Sutton's petition as a starting point for an alternative reparations tradition. This tradition, comprised of an abundance of voices and made up of narratives and images like Sutton's, refuse to rehabilitate a unified state memory, insisting instead on the democratic potential of what Michael Hanchard calls Black memory. By way of conclusion, I'll draw on Toni Morrison's written and multimedia explorations of the foreigner's home as an example of a way of imagining a reordered polity by exceeding the limits of what is currently deemed to be politically possible or desirable. So here I quote, 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, 35 years of racist housing policy. Until we reckon with our compounding moral debts, America will never be whole. By framing his widely read case for reparations in these terms, Coates taps into the idea that one of the most effective ways, perhaps the most effective way, to advance the cause of racial justice in the US is to summon an ideal of the nation and call for its redemption or wholeness. Although this ideal has long been an element of reparations arguments, especially those that conceive slavery in terms of original sin, its visibility has been heightened as the idea of providing material and symbolic redress moved from the margins to the political mainstream. At a congressional hearing in 2019, for example, Senator Cory Booker tied the idea of reparations to a nation where our ancestors spoke from the good book, where justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. The vision of a nation cleansed of its slave past animates many arguments for reparations, including one of the most influential. In From Here to Equality, William Darity Jr. and Kirsten Mullen lay out a powerful argument for a national plan of reparations as a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for grievous injustice. If successful, they maintain, reparations would eliminate racial inequality in a range of domains, and most importantly, abolish the racial wealth gap that they identify as the primary indicator of past and present operations of white supremacy. From our perspective, they assert reparations for Black Americans are an obligation that need not be linked to guilt or shame, but driven by the recognition of the need for national redemption. Bless you. Their approach has many important antecedents. One reading, although not the only one, Martin Luther King Jr.'s multiple calls for reparations de-emphasizes the anti-colonial and anti-imperial dimensions of his democratic vision by interpreting his articulation of what is owed to Black Americans in light of his soaring rhetoric about the American dream. And even Black nationalist activists have made use of redemptive language. In her 1963 pamphlet, Why Reparations?, Queen Mother Audley Moore observes that compensation to descendants of enslaved people is essential, and here I quote, "If the government of the United States is ever to wipe the slate clear, redeem herself, and pay for the damages she has inflicted upon more than 25 million American citizens who are members of the Black race." In different ways, these conceptions of repair resonate with Richard Rorty's contention that you have to be loyal to a dream country rather than to the one to which you wake up every day. Now, if there's a great deal of truth in the contention that an effective way to unify US citizens around a controversial cause or enlist the privileged in efforts that aim to redistribute power more equally is to tell an inspiring story about the American democratic project, there is equally a great deal of danger. For it is precisely this point that reparations demands risk becoming part of a centuries-long chorus of left and liberal projects that contribute to democracy's undoing by domesticating the story of slavery, eliding the irreparable losses sustained in the forced migration and devastation of millions of lives, and disavowing the interrelationship between slavery, settler colonialism, and coloniality. As scholars and activists have long insisted, reparations cannot be confined to the domestic space of the nation state. From abolitionist politics in the early years of the US to 21st century grassroots organizing, radical demands for reparations have conceived redress as a dynamic, ongoing struggle for a new world, rather than a quest for payment, inclusion, closure, or redemption. The Movement for Black Lives Reparations platform offers an example of the way that the language of reparations has been used to address a broad array of economic, political, and cultural changes that a multiracial democracy would require, including the establishment of solidaristic ties to other struggles both within and beyond the US. In Idam Getachu's view, the Movement for Black Lives demonstrates, and here I'm quoting, an incipient language and vision of Black internationalism, building on earlier traditions and identifying a shared field of political struggle with anti-imperial and progressive forces around the world. Let's return for a moment to Audley Moore's 1963 pamphlet. Published by the Reparations Committee for United Slaves' Descendants on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the pamphlet focuses on the forms of theft that African Americans endured as what she calls step citizens in the US. It calls for a massive program of preferential treatment and hiring as a mechanism for realizing economic equality, and it ends with an invocation of the American dream. To stop there, however, would be to miss the broader history of Moore's activism. The commitment to bottom-up organizing that informs her reparations demands was cultivated by early membership in Marcus Garvey's UNIA and her work as a co-founder of the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women. She also played a pivotal role in multiple reparations advocacy groups and is remembered for her insistence that reparations address the needs of women and working class people, that the struggle not be confined to the US, and that Black self-determination in various forms was essential. As historian Eric McDuffie remarks, Moore demanded reparations for slavery, Jim Crow, and colonialism. Focusing on the Caribbean context, anthropologist Deborah Thomas advances an argument for reparations as what she calls a framework for thinking, which might, in her words, allow connections to be made between phenomena that are not usually seen as connected. The transformative potential of reparations as a framework or critical language, she maintains, resides in its capacity to challenge existing notions of citizenship and sovereignty. Reflecting on the 2001 UN Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance in Durban, Thomas observes, damages were portrayed as not only economic in nature, but also political and cultural. It was not only states, but also companies and individuals who operated in transnational spheres who were being called to account. And redress was imagined in various planes, all of which reflected a deep understanding that geopolitical relations, past and present, are global in scope and therefore have global implications. Recent books by philosopher Olufemi Taiwo and historian Chris Manjapra developed their own versions of this insight, demonstrating why it's essential to understand how reparations claims can serve both to surface and to address the inequities produced by modern global entanglements. Manjapra contends that reparations, quote, requires nothing less than the transformation of the world. A lofty ambition? Yes, but he traces its contours in the actions of enslaved people and their descendants who have exposed the oppressive features of state-led emancipation projects and fought with love for self-determination and the creation of new non-state forms of sovereignty. For Taiwo, reparations must be conceived as a constructive world-making project. There seems to be a continuation from the earlier panel. One of the distinguishing features of his argument is his critique of a focus on racial disparities that is the hallmark of many US reparations claims, especially those that seek an economic fix for racial injustice, and his insistence that climate justice and reparations are the same project. Among other things, Taiwo's argument suggests that aligning the boundaries of reparations with existing borders may improve the position of African American citizens by suppressing US responsibility for the persistent global effects of slavery and colonialism. In this light, historian Robin Kelly raises a critical question that is too rarely uttered in conversations about reparations as a national project. Is it possible to reconcile reparations for slavery and structural racism with decolonization? Kelly's question hints at why tying reparations to the rights of citizens and the redemption of the nation fails to counter democracy's undoing. By reproducing a narrative in which chattel slavery and indigenous genocide are separated from the legitimacy of democratic political institutions, the idea of perfecting the nation through repair elides the violence through which those institutions came into being and on which they continue to rely. It suggests that it's possible to defend the principles as though they are the authentic, if latent, heart of a polity untouched by white supremacy, and to disavow the continuing work of national boundaries in the production and preservation of racial hierarchy. As Ronaldo Walcott observes, appeals to the nation as a site of Black aspiration are self-undermining, for they elide the conditions that produced slavery and the dehumanizing discourses of Blackness and as modern freedom's necessary counterpart. These appeals also fail to call into question the formulation of the demos, whose undoing has been cause for so much concern, and perpetuate the illusion of what philosopher Christy Dotson calls the ever-present triad of settler, native, slave. Framing reparations as the realization of a more perfect union and an overdue promise to African Americans as US citizens also disguises the ways that the boundaries of citizenship rely on the production and maintenance of racial categories. This approach is in keeping with what Paulina Ochoa Espejo has described as the desert island model of territorial politics in democratic theory. According to this familiar model, effective self-governance requires the establishment of a distinct autonomous territory under the control of a definable demos. Insofar as reparations depend on demarcating the line between inside and outside, between longtime African-American residents and more recent immigrants in many cases, it mischaracterizes and reinforces the anti-Blackness it purports to contest. As Tendayi Achiume observes, first world citizenship is racially bordered, and it in turn operates as a crucial component of racial bordering. By linking citizenship to whiteness, to property, racialized border controls perpetuate the accumulation of wealth in countries like the US that are enriched by centuries of colonialism and neocolonialism. Indeed, from Achiume's vantage, one form that reparations ought to take is the development of more open migration regulations. Even when contemporary borders are not their focus, reparations demands can keep alive stories of captivity and forced migration, like the one Sutton recounts in her petition, reveal the limits of creedal stories of national redemption, and raise the question of what forms of oppression, theft, and violence are required to sustain US citizens' democratic freedoms. That Sutton devotes the longest paragraph of her petition to a recitation of what she has lost in the passage from West Africa to New England also indicates the difference between a conception of reparations attuned to what Manjapra calls history's unendings and a conception animated by the dream of full inclusion or closure. Too often, such a dream imposes a burden of expressing forgiveness or gratitude on reparations' intended beneficiaries and skips past unredressed legacies of slavery. Insistence that the nation can be redeemed too easily translates into the demand that Black Americans get over the past. And the enthusiasm of conservative commentators like Charles Krauthammer and more recently Russ Dutout for reparations proposals as a one-time alternative to race-conscious policies laid bare the pitfalls of such an approach. Further, I would say that the demonization of Black Lives Matter protesters demonstrates the dangers of programs that bring some Black citizens into the national fold by denigrating the actions of those who dare to criticize or oppose the status quo. Law professor Eric Yamamoto forecast some of these concerns in his 1998 assessment of reparations for Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. Although he praises the positive effects of offering compensation, however modest, to individual recipients and the potential of the Japanese American struggle to stimulate organizing for the redress of other forms of racial injustice, Yamamoto warns about what he calls the underside of reparations. Without attitudinal and social structural transformation of a sort meaningful to recipients, he notes, reparations may be illusory, more damaging than healing, no repair, cheap grace. He further observes that congressional hearings emphasized the sacrifices of some internees as deserving super patriots and did not refer to those who resisted the draft or participated in riots or hunger strikes to protest the imprisonment of their communities. Some longstanding reparations advocates, like legal scholar Roy Brooks, for whom forgiveness is actually a key element of his arguments, have embraced a version of the super patriot strategy, arguing that activist approaches pose a threat to reparations as a political project and insisting that claims must be advanced in ways that reinforce rather than disturb an existing common sense. In light of the recent spread and popularity of such arguments, Juliet Hooker opts for the term redress in lieu of repair, reasoning that the latter reinforces, and here I quote, a dynamic whereby Black politics is viewed primarily in terms of its potential to solve the problems of white democracy. Hooker's critique of reparations as a political concept speaks to the pitfalls of compensatory projects that reinforce an ideal of US democracy, as something that can and should be redeemed. Taking her concerns as a starting point, I'd like to conclude by exploring other ways of making the demand, other ways to imagine what reparations might be and do. I ask how an old concept can speak to a moment that feels new. Where commentators worry about an unprecedented rupture in norms and institutions that have anchored modern dreams of democratic life, Sutton's petition, the Reparations Now toolkit, and the imaginative work of generations of radical reparations activists speak of other ruptures whose effects persist both spectacularly and on a lower frequency. Gathering the histories of slavery, colonialism, and their living legacies, they seek the words, images, and sounds that convey a living history that both precedes and exceeds the boundaries of the current crisis. They include Alabama's poet laureate, Ashley M. Jones, who repurposes George Wallace's infamous 1963 inaugural address in a 5-part meditation on reparations now, reparations tomorrow, reparations forever. I wish we still had the image from the cafe that Tony shared with us yesterday. In this sense, the concept of reparations has always involved, as David Scott observes, a politics and poetics. Another way to say this is to borrow Anne Laura Stoller's comments about approaching duress as a political concept, in which she writes, it needs the poetics of thought to make its case. Whether this entails calling on poets or finding that poetics are already central to concept formation, Stoller writes, the sensorial insights are crucial to the critical impulse that hover unarticulated on our tongues and that flourish in what some are already saying and others cannot hear. Perhaps no writer has done more to explore this joining of what some are already saying and others of us cannot hear through literature than Toni Morrison. Although she does not use the language of reparations, and in fact, I went to hear a reading of one of her novels where she actively refused this language. Nonetheless, I'm going to draw on her. I think she's very helpful for thinking about the concept. Her writing limns modern atrocity and the abundance of Black life simultaneously, making visible and audible the afterlives of slavery and colonial predation, and offering new ways of imagining a reordered polity that exceeds the limits of what is currently deemed to be possible or desirable. For Morrison, the overweening defining event of the modern world is the mass movement of raced populations, beginning with the largest forced transfer of people in the history of the world, slavery. This uprooting and relocation of millions of human beings not only constituted a new global geography, it proclaimed the advent of new democracies as it established the conditions for their unraveling. In Morrison's view, the contemporary world's work has become policing, halting, forming policy regarding, and trying to administer the movement of people. Although she develops this insight in many of her novels, I want to close by turning briefly to her nonfiction reflections on what she calls the foreigner's home, and to the 2019 film by the same name. The film, which interweaves a 2006 exhibition that she curated at the Louvre with a subsequent interview by Edwige Danticat at Morrison's home on the Hudson River, with performances by street poets from immigrant communities in France, with photographs, videos, and animated drawings of contemporary migrants in the Mediterranean, and with Theodore Géricault's 19th century oil, The Raft of the Medusa, makes explicit the connection between the vessels that transported Sutton and more than 12.5 million other men, women, and children from Central and West Africa to the Western Hemisphere between the 15th and 19th centuries, on the one hand, and the millions of displaced and dispossessed people of the 21st on the other. The question of the foreigner's home is a question about the boundaries of democracy, geographic, temporal, moral. It's also a question about reparations. For Morrison's lifelong project of re-inhabiting the lives of people like Sutton and her descendants, who endured forced movement to a land that declared itself free, echoes Edouard Glissant's observation that modern slavery begins in deportation. It traces a line between a democratic reconstruction that named refugees, freedmen, and abandoned lands as objects of governmental management to the experiences of people who have been forced out of their homes by climate disaster, political repression, and economic devastation, or who, like the survivors of Hurricane Katrina, have been made foreigners in their own home. When Morrison proposes near the end of the film that we are dreaming all wrong, and she actually says this sort of over an image, a highly stylized sort of animated drawing of a migrant moving against an image of a barbed wire fence. We are dreaming all wrong, she says, recalling that the assault on democracy did not begin with the new authoritarianisms of the 21st century or the rise of neoliberalism in the 20th. It can be traced at least as far back as the moment when Belinda Sutton understood, quote, that Europeans place their happiness in the yellow dust which she carelessly marked with her infant foot. Morrison's gift is to conjure scenes out of the words and images and demand that we not look away from the forced crossings, removals, the division of citizen from foreigner, native, slave, out of which democracy has been constituted. Reparations in this sense is a political concept and a poetic utterance. It names both the visionary work of grassroots movements and an idea that has achieved unprecedented traction in academic and other elite spaces. Some reparations demands a conclusion in a more fair, but nonetheless racially predatory capitalist economy. Some offer an alibi for liberal legal systems predicated on racial hierarchy. Some reinforce the power of Black elites. Some salve white anxieties about the loss of status or property, but there are others. Starting from the articulation of what is irreparable, these reparations demands are less interested in the ends of democracy than how to inaugurate its beginning.